Hello, all, and welcome to the podcast on Tibetscapes. Tibetscapes is a research collective based at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, that focuses on academic studies related to Tibet, Himalayas, and the border regions. I'm Ashwati, a research scholar studying gender and Tibetan exile, while also being a contributor to Tibetscapes.
Today we have with us Tsering Wangmo Dhompa, a voice that speaks the stories of displacement and the beauty of the mountains that echo a longing for home. Her poetry exudes memories of a home that she says is not a place but a feeling. Tseringla's works navigate and oscillate between the paradoxes of memory and absence, home and displacement, and belonging and loss. Tsering Wangmo Dhompa is a Tibetan poet and writer whose works provide an intimate glimpse into life in exile through her memoirs coupled with a historical reflection. Her prominent works include poetry collections such as Rules of the House and in the Absent Everyday, My Rice Tastes Like the Lake, and her very critically acclaimed memoir, A Home in Tibet. Tseringla continues to write and teach and contributes to conversations around exile, and which forms a very vital part of the Tibetan diasporic literature. It is my honor today to have her speak about her new book, Politics and Sorrow. The book Politics and Sorrow is an account of the community known as the Group of the 13 as a way to inquire into the contesting politics of unity and regionalism in exile. The book brings out the politics of forging unity in exile and accounts in great details the narratives and ideas of the ones who were not privileged to be included in the Tibetan Nation and history building, the ones she refers to as the peripheral characters in the Tibetan Nation. We welcome her on Tibetscapes, and we're so happy to have you here, Tseringla.
Thank you so much, Ashwati, and I'm really happy to be in conversation with you today.
So, Tseringla, just to look at how you view this book in the wide array of Tibetan literature, I would like to begin by asking you, how do you situate this book in understanding the life in exile for the Tibetan community?
Thank you for this question, because I think, in part, it's also working to include the Tibetan experience of exile into, I think, a larger discourse, right, of the study of exile and nationalism. I think that one of the things that I'm also interested in is thinking about the time that Tibetans were suddenly, their lives were disrupted, right, in a moment in time in history when so many other nations were gaining their freedom. And so, I think that in some ways, right, like it's this movement upstream for us in that larger moment of national liberation and decolonization. In terms of Tibetan studies, I think, this book is really looking at the first 3 decades of life in exile. 1960s to probably 1980s. And this is the moment when the government in exile was really consolidating itself as the representative of Tibetans in exile, as well as, forming what, I think I would say like an anti-colonial movement, right? And so it's also a moment when the community is thinking about the role of historical players and institutions in creating versions of community and history. And, when you do that, I think what becomes really important is what's left out, right? And so I think that's sort of where perhaps the book begins. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that translates into the title of the book, which is very intriguing. It embraces so many paradoxes. And so the next question is somewhere about the title of the book. It engages with the idea of displacement and loss. And can you tell us how it conveys the politics of sorrow and how you'd want readers to interpret this politics? Because it's not just the loss of one's homeland, but it is also the loss of one's own narrative, one's own memory in the pursuit of building a coherent collective memory. So how do you view that?
I think I was drawn to the title because in the process of listening to the stories, I understood that for many of the individuals I was engaging with, this was a very personal story, right? And I think the loss and the relation to nation is a very personal one. And so this title is not something that I, coined. It was a title of a article in the Tibetan Review in 1978, and so I borrowed it from there. But I think partly, right, when I think about the politics of sorrow, it is largely, I think, stemming from exclusion to some extent, right? So I think a lot about the pitfalls of a single narrative a lot, and this book is really an offering to having multiple versions of what it means to be a Tibetan in exile. And even though, the idea of unity was extremely important in the early years in building and maintaining, I think, an anti-colonial movement such as the Tibetan case, I think, it was really important to maintain a multiplicity of voices and languages. And I think that it was very crucial to find a way to coexist, to understand, each other and make room for one another, especially since Tibetans who fled Tibet in 1959 were coming from many, many different and diverse political polities and, social communities. And so I think the idea of the Tibetan that we've formed over time in exile is different, right? So I think, I would hope readers, to understand that unity is not always, it doesn't always translate into inclusion, and recognition is really important for everybody. And so the politics of sorrow is about that, right? The desire to be meaningful to the process of building a community and a nation in exile, and to be valued and to be seen. And my, hope is that the 13 are represented in exile history. Not in a way that they have been so far as sort of like a one-dimensional stereotype, but I, hope that they can be seen as Tibetans and as refugees who accomplished a great deal for their communities, right? And I see this book as, a kind of beginning of a much needed dialogue on our time in exile, both in India and increasingly, right, a much more diasporic community.
That's very interesting, Serengla. This naturally brings me to my next question. Serengla, would this statement capture the essence and the core argument of your book? In ideas of nation and history, there are some that are privileged and there are some that are not privileged to be included. Would you say that this captures the core essence of your book?
Yeah, I do think, to a large extent it does. And I think, the story of any nation and history will probably teach us that, right? Um, and I think, partly the book is also pointing to loss, right, underlying this recent history, and how the story of exile is also the story of recovery, and and how the loss of nation is a painful experience because it means a loss of so many other things, right? And individuals take multiple paths and diverse paths to find the things or maintain the things that help them manage the suffering that follows the loss, right? And so I think that, yes, certainly, I agree with your statement that ideas of nation and history become normalized, right? And of course, we have to think about power, right? Who has power? What are the institutions and players involved? What is forgotten and left out, right? And I think Ernest Renan's puts it so succinctly in his essay to sort of suggest that forgetfulness is really essential also in the creation of a nation. Yeah.
So, Serena, speaking of loss and belonging and displacement, um, I would want to know, can I say that this book is as much autobiographical as it is an oral history?
Um, well, I mean, I guess it is, it is nonfiction in that, I am the one interpreting and I am the one, and my views, I think come through. But I wouldn't say it's autobiography, although I can see that, if you read the preface, it gives that suggestion, right? It begins on a note that comes from, sort of the personal, right? So I do understand that. But I think it is about the 13, right? And it is about sort of the players in that particular moment in time. Um, and so, yeah, um, I wouldn't, yeah. I don't think of it as autobiographical, right? I think that my interest from it is probably a personal curiosity. But I think, that partly I would see it as kind of oral history, right? And I also think about sort of, the other part of your question in terms of sort of the private and the public space, right? And I think that those are also really interesting because I think those things can mean very different things in different moments in time. And so in a moment of in a moment of crisis, I think I wonder, where the boundaries are between the private and the public. And for a lot of the elders that I was speaking to, they would, sort of alternate between me and our, or I and we, right? And so, yeah, so in that way, I think maybe it is a biography, right, of a people in some ways.
So, Serena, when histories are suppressed against the histories that are institutionalized, it is very difficult to create a public space for such conversations. How does that change? How do you navigate that? And how does that change your process of authorship?
Mm. That's such a, I mean, I think that's a great question. I'm understanding the question in like two ways, right? One, um, how do you write a story um, that is both personal and communal, and the other, how do I, as a writer and a listener, translate those experiences, but also what is the effect of it on me, right? I don't know if that's sort of what your question is about, right?
Yeah, that kind of answers the question. I was just very intrigued by how
Yeah,
you change and tweak your process of writing because I
yeah. You know,
I
I, sorry, go ahead.
please go on, please go on.
Um, I think, sort of to answer that first part, just last week, my graduate students and I were reading Gayatri Spivak's seminal essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Um, and we sort of, came to the conclusion that we there wasn't any one kind of way, right? Um, in terms of representing someone else's story, particularly, I think, in this kind of context, a story that is about dispossession, right? And even though I was familiar with, I think, the effects of dispossession and loss, just because I was a child of, a parent whose entire family was left behind in Tibet, and that shaped, much of my mother's life, and in turn my life too, right? And as much as I knew many of the elders that I was speaking to, I really struggled to write the story. I think for a number of reasons. Um, I think one being that the process of talking about their fears and losses, I was very aware that they were also experiencing, those feelings again, right? And so I felt like it was a really delicate process to coax memories, at the same time also soften, right, their grief. Another challenge was also regarding, again, the private and the public, right, in terms of how individuals were navigating both personal and communal feelings. And probably, I think what I mean by that is also that exile it can be experienced very personally. These are personal feelings and emotions, but they're also inseparable, right, from the loss of a way of life, loss of community. So I think I had to keep in mind both the individual and the communal kind of registers and memories. I thought a lot about like how I should listen, right? In terms of translation, people were speaking in different dialects sometimes, and so the translations of the terms themselves into English, um, and the way that people remember, right, the past, and so the mode of storytelling, right, oral presentation, fragmentary, circular, a lot of repetitions. And so I had to also figure out like how to write them in a way that captured both their storytelling, but also like how to write it in a way that readers can also understand, right? So I think I rewrote it so many times. I experimented with different forms, but I think I had to remind myself constantly, to like listen with attention and also to understand, interpret, and translate without getting too much in the way of making meaning, right? Which was hard, because I also felt a lot while listening, right? So yeah.
Thank you, Serengla. I was really intrigued by what went behind the process of writing this, because when you share stories of displacement and personal accounts, it could be very enabling as a writer, and it somewhere tweaks your process of authorship. So that was great insights into how you write and how you view it. Thank you so much.
It was very difficult. It took me like 9 years, right? Also, I mean, how we remember and what we remember, like these are not straightforward things, right? And so I had to go back to certain people. I had to, bounce off different stories. Sometimes people would remember a text and that would lead me to a text, and then I'd look for the text and then return to them to, consider like what about that text was difficult for them, right? And so, yeah, a lot of back and forth, like I would say, yeah.
So, Serengla, can you elaborate a little on how hegemonic views and ideas affect or enable the communitarian exercise of nation building in Tibet?
I mean, I guess again, both personal and communitarian effects, right? I think that a hegemonic view of nation or national identity, again, as I'd mentioned earlier or referred to earlier to Renan, is about forgetting or erasure, even if that's not the intention, right? So I think, assimilation is very often viewed as necessary, and it is, at moments in time. But for those who feel the pressure to conform, I think it means losing the very small and crucial details that allow for some kind of consolation, right, in times of dispossession. Language, stories, a sense of self, and also a sense of being in relation, right, with others or in place. So I think in that way, I'm looking very specifically, right, at events and texts in the 1970s and 60s, when national unity was really crucial in the effort to build, sort of this anti-colonial movement. And I think at that moment, right, the task of bringing a very diverse group of people with, diverse experiences of political systems was, very, I would say, like a very difficult task, right? Both for the government, but also for the people, and particularly for the people who probably were living under different political and social systems in Tibet, and not necessarily under the Tibetan government, prior to 1950, right? So I think the conditions of that time, the demands of that time, were very different from, say, contemporary moment today, right? I think there was a lot more urgency, a lot more at stake at that time than today. Um, and most post-colonial theorists and writers have pointed out that nationalism is often led by elite and not those by the periphery, right? And that those on the periphery are often not included in the decision-making process, or also, not really, their contributions are also not visible in that way. I think that, it's very different today. The values and the ideas of what it means to be Tibetan probably are, much more centralized and normalized today. It wasn't so clear in the early days of exile, right? And so I think that, what I'm writing about is probably relevant today to some extent, but it's different. It's very hard for me to see today what exactly is at stake. I think that in the early days of exile, Tibetans were very much united in the hope of returning to Tibet, right? I think that loss was, so palpable, right? So there was a shared goal in that. Um, I'm not so sure today. Tibetans are scattered all across the world. And it's hard to tell what, the many generations, now we have, many generations of Tibetans. So it's hard to tell what they feel and think about Tibet and how central a role it plays in their everyday lives, right? So I think there's a very roundabout way to talk about hegemonic views of Tibetan history, but I think, I do have to navigate what the book is about, which is about those early days, right? When it was really a transformation of both personal and community. And today, I think the questions and the urgencies are probably very different, right? Even though I think the old conflicts probably still linger.
Thank you, Sarangla. So when I read the preface of the book, a thought that immediately popped up in my mind is what fueled you to taking you back to the time when you might have started, thinking about penning this book down. What sparked your interest in writing this in writing this book? Because it is a contested story. There are so many complexities in navigating through this. So, what sparked your interest in writing the story about the group of 13?
Thank you for that question. To be honest, I think out of curiosity, right? I think that as a writer, I'm often curious about the things that people are silent about. And so I could not find a satisfying answer to so many questions that I had while growing up, right? Like, why do we speak so much about regional tensions in our community, right? Like, what do people mean by regionalism, right? And what do these terms mean to Tibetans in the 1960s and today, right? Or like 1950s when they were back in Tibet, right? Like, what did those terms mean? I also was so curious about, like, what do Tibetans mean when they name each other like patriots or dissidents, right? In the present moment, why do Tibetan politicians always talk about unity, right? Like, unity was always stressed in almost every speech. What does exile mean? And the uncertainty, of return to one's nation mean over this long extended period of time, right? Like, I was very much aware of, my mother's feelings about Tibet and return to Tibet because her family was all left behind there, right? And I was the only sort of family, right, in some ways. So, I had all of these questions. And then I also knew many people from the settlements established by the 13. And I sensed that they lived with a kind of like uneasiness, right? Like there was some sense of stigma attached to their identity in exile. they felt excluded or dismissed or maybe misinterpreted. And then the larger community, I felt, saw them as a kind of a threat to both the government and the community, as if they had separated themselves. So I really felt like I wanted to know their stories because I thought maybe it would help me also understand questions that I was interested in, right? And this question of belonging, which, I often think about, right?
Um, Serena, I feel that the book dwells into, I mean, in very fine details into the complexities of having a shared imagination of a geographical and cultural territory. What do you want the readers to take back about the life in exile of the Tibetan community?
Um, I don't know. I think probably, for people to understand that even though I'm talking about the conflict, and the tensions within the community, I do want people to understand, what the tremendous task it has been, or it was, and it still is, right? To maintain a struggle, to maintain a sense of place, a sense of community in exile. So I think in that way, the Tibetan government in exile and the Tibetan exile community is quite an incredible formation, right? And I think that what the community has achieved in exile is something that I do appreciate and want to be proud about. And I think that I wish for readers to remember and to realize that the Tibetan struggle is an ongoing struggle. That the refugee or the exiled government still exists in India, even as we're scattered around the world. Tibet still exists. Tibetans continue to live on the land, and that the hope of a free Tibet, is still alive in many of us, right? And so I think um, ultimately, I think that's what I um, hope, readers to take away. Just because we've lived in exile for 60 plus years doesn't mean um, we don't carry that sense of imagination of a future, right? That's different from what we have today. Yeah. That's not I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think that's one of the I guess the heartbeats of the book also, right?
That's true. That's true. And Serena, thank you so much for briefing us into this book. But it's a personal question outside of the purview of the book. I was reading about a conversation that you had with Tenzin, and you say that poetry is your first love. It's the primary lens from which you look at the world. Serena, how do you find the perfect interface between literature and politics, especially with poetry as a medium?
Mm. Um, hmm. I think, poetry, to me, right, the poems that are um, really exciting are the ones that I think interrogate the society we live in, right? In that way, I think, I think in terms of being a Tibetan, um, writing about my life, is at once, I think, political, right? Because it is about sort of it is about a struggle for a particular kind of future, right? The language I write in, the places I am in, all of these are linked to history. So I think personally, I think that there's not a separation, right, in what I think about and how I live and the effects of the historical unraveling, right? So yeah, I guess I don't even know how to answer that question because I don't think of it as being separate, right? The line, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
But I think poetry is a powerful tool, right, to engage in uh, both like very personal terms and in abstract terms, right? The effects of what it means to be a human, what it means to be living as a human under particular moments in time, and the weight of, history, how it shapes an individual's life, uh, which individuals are impacted and who are not, right? All of these questions, I think, yeah.
thank you so much, Tsering.
Maybe I need to listen to your question again to like answer it.
Oh no.
I'm a very slow thinker, actually. So I think sometimes I just get aspects of a person's question and then I go off in that direction and I miss the other half. Yeah. So sorry if I haven't addressed your question.
No, not at all. Thank you so much. I just wanted to get a tidbit about, like, a little bit in your headspace, because I've been a great admirer of your work and I've always
Oh.
interacted with your work. Now that I'm interacting with you, that was just a personal question that I wanted to ask you. So thank you.
Thank
And
you.
Tseringla, thank you so much. And it gives great insights into the book. And I'm very eager to read it. And we're all, as part of Tibetscapes, we're very eager to read the book. And thank you so much for doing this podcast. And especially on a Sunday and morning.
No, it's such a pleasure, Ashwati, and thank you so much, to Tibetscapes.